the answer can depend a lot on who you ask. If you ask a regulator, the regulator will tell you, well, of course companies have an incentive to share information with their competitors. We're trying to stop them from sharing information all the time. On the other hand, if you go ask a company, they'll say, oh, of course not. We're putting all this effort in trying to keep the information and our marketing research in-house and make sure that that information doesn't leak to our competitors. So that's what I wanted to assess. I wanted to look at a particular market and understand who is right. I basically looked at a market that had a specific set of characteristics that we basically had no predictions for. That market was the Dram industry. So these are the makers of the memory chips that go into our everyday computers, cell phones, tablets, etc. And it's a very, very turbulent industry. The reason is that these companies are making memory chips today. They're investing today in production capacity. But they'll only see that output 3, 6 months, 9 months from today. So what that means is that today, this manager, a particular manager, has to decide how much to invest in capacity, thinking about what will happen to the market 6 months from today. And that's very hard in an industry that really fluctuates around with the economy. I actually found that these companies benefit from sharing information with their competitors. But the question was why? Because actually our knowledge would have predicted that these companies didn't really have an incentive to do so. And so it's worth visiting a little bit of why is it that a company can benefit from sharing information or not. The good news is if you share information with a rival, well, there is good news. You get better information, and so you make better decisions. That's a very direct effect. But there's also an indirect effect, and we've known this for a while. The indirect effect is that sharing information is going to make everyone's information more similar. For example, in good times, when the market is doing very well and it's growing, and we're likely to get a good information, a positive information, now we share that information, we're even more reliant on that. We had the same idea that the market was going to grow, and so we're both going to invest a lot. And in markets that are not doing so well, we share information. We both confirm that actually the market is not doing so well. We're going to, in this particular case, we're going to produce very little, for example. Now, what happens is that we'll sometimes make mistakes. We don't have perfect information. And so it may just so happen that on a particular period, we both produced a lot, or the whole industry produced a lot, because it shared information. It was really relying on this information that was so similar across all the companies. But this can take the whole industry, from one moment to the next to overproduction and really low prices, very low profitability. And so that's the peril of sharing information, is that there is a risk that the whole industry will move in the wrong direction. Now, what does that mean? How is that compared to a case of no information sharing? Well, if companies didn't share information, maybe one company would produce a little too much, but the other would produce a little too little, and the market will be more stable in terms of the market price and profitability. But once you share information, you'll make these industry mistakes more often. The DRAM industry is not the only unstable industry out there. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of turbulent industries. And actually, if you think of any semiconductor industry, hard drives, memory, anything computer related, for example, there's a lot of variability in demand. This means that governments are usually prone to protect these companies because there's very few of them. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of R&D efforts, incredible competences that would be lost if each of these companies disappears. And so there's a natural tendency to protect them, which I think actually makes sense. Now, the question is, what does information sharing have to say about that? Does information sharing increase the market variability, or does it reduce it? And actually, what I found is that information sharing in this particular market, the DRAM industry, actually would smoothen the industry. So this relates back to why this is a good decision for firms. It turns out that in this type of industry with such an accommodating demand, mistakes are well absorbed by their demand. And so actually the profit variability decreases when information sharing takes place. So it's also an appealing measure for regulators trying to protect these types of companies. Another part of the market is very important as well is the consumers and all the downstream market, let's say computer manufacturers, consumers. And I've looked at that as well to see whether they would be negatively affected because the relationship between a company and the consumer, there's always going to be some joint value, but then the question is who appropriates the value. So the question is, are the gains from information sharing coming from increasing the size of the pie, or is it just giving a bigger slice to the companies that are now doing information sharing? So what I found is actually that the size of the pie increases because these companies are actually going to produce more or less depending exactly on the market needs. And so what ends up happening is that there will actually be on average more output, which means lower prices in this industry. And so as a whole, the downstream market, meaning whoever's buying these products from these companies, so that means computer manufacturers and as a result necessarily consumers, they can't be worse off. They're going to be better off from having information sharing at a higher level. There's no general rule to predict whether information sharing is going to be good or bad, but there are some clues. And here's the biggest clue I've been able to find in this study. The more your demand can basically, your customers can use your product for many different things, the better off you are sharing information. So in the end, what you want to look for is for a forgiving demand. What I mean by that is customers who are willing to take more production and not penalize the company with price, with willingness to pay. And so that will happen more in companies that are higher up in the supply chain. Those companies can produce a little more of a certain raw material or a little less, and the effect won't be as harsh as it will be later on the supply chain where a cell phone or a tablet or whatever is what it is, and there's not much else that can be done with it.